Hi, this is Dr. B, and in this video, I'm going to go over white papers, which is a type of report. I'm going to go over white papers and reports kind of generally, and then I'm going to give you some tips for how to be successful in your assignment. So for this assignment, your group is going to write a white paper, and this is the final assignment in your group project. This is a collaborative document. What is a white paper? A white paper is a type of report. Reports occur at different stages of a professional writing cycle, and a lot of times at the end of a project you will write either maybe a technical report or a white paper. A white paper is more common in industry. The idea is that the white paper is a report that is geared more toward a public audience, like a client or an interested party. They may be available on the internet for anyone to read, and so they're not written to an internal audience. So it's a type of report. It is a cohesive narrative. It usually reports on the problem itself as well as then the solution or the project that the report is centered on. It provides necessary information, background information on the project, on the problem. It provides a really in-depth overview of the project or solution. And, there are two kind of key things about this. The first is because it's written to a public audience, someone who is not internal, like to your organization, you have to provide a bit more background than you might on an internal document. And the second is, even though this is a report where you're providing them information and an evaluation of a project, it is also slightly persuasive. So the big challenge here will be to differentiate your proposal from a report, but the benefit is that you'll be able to reuse and revise some of the content from your proposal into your final paper. So you may be familiar with technical reports. If you go to your textbook, chapter 11 is on analytical reports. It has really good information about types of reports, and it has common report sections, design, checklists. A lot of this information would be really useful to you if you've never written a report before and cannot offer as a guide. But one of the main differences is that this kind of analytical report is more for an internal professional audience, and your white paper that you're writing is a report more for an interested public audience. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the differences and similarities behind proposal and a white paper. So if you remember, this is the basic outline of a proposal that we discussed at the beginning of the project, where you'll have an introduction section that announces the purpose of the document, provides background on the topic, and kind of discusses what's coming up in the rest, the remainder of the proposal. There's a problem statement that will eventually kind of outline who the users are and offer a profile of those users. There's typically some sort of literature review, either on the problem itself or a review of previous designs and maybe why a solution is still needed. And then there's the actual solution section, which is pitching the solution or the project and going a very in-depth overview of the project plan, etc., and then a conclusion. So the proposal here that you've written has a lot of information that can be repurposed into a proposal, but you have to understand these are two different documents with two different audiences. So the proposal was an internal document. You're pitching your project to me. You're trying to narrow down your version of the problem. You're trying to pitch your user guides as a solution, and you're going to you're giving me a project plan for how you're going to complete it. It's an internal document to your project manager. However, the white paper is not written as an internal document to your project manager. It's written to an interested member of the public, let's say like a potential set of clients or something like that. So while you may have some information that you can repurpose, it's really important to know that you have to revise it so that it makes sense in the white paper. A white paper typically, and as a report, typically has these types of components. Again, there is an introduction. This is usually some way of making that document relevant to the reader, providing important background information. There is a problem statement that describes the problem in detail. It usually breaks it down in a really granular way. It does discuss the project or solution to that problem. And this is going to be slightly different because your project is finished now. So you can give them a really good technical breakdown or preview, overview, whatever, of the actual project itself. And you should be able to write about this in a lot more detail because you've done it now. It's not like in the proposal where you're talking about something you haven't done yet. They're typically, especially in more technical reports, there's some sort of evaluation, but even in a white paper, you have to argue in some way, subtly or no, that your solution is a good solution to the problem. The idea is that you're telling someone, hey, I found a problem. Here's what I know about the problem. Here's all the things that we've learned about this problem. Now, here is a solution to the problem. Here's how my solution works. Here's how my solution solves this problem. This is why my solution is a good fit for this problem and why you should use my solution. So it's a report, but it's slightly persuasive. And while it has these components and they're very similar to a proposal, it's really, really important to understand that they occur at different places in the project cycle. A proposal is persuasive and then it's pitching an idea. It's trying to obtain approval for a project. You're pitching to your project manager. You're saying to your project manager or to a granting organization or to a funder, someone, you're saying, hey, here's a problem that exists in the world. Let me convince you this problem exists the way I see it. I have a really great idea. Let me tell you what it is. Let me outline that idea. And then I'm the right person to get this idea done. Let me tell you my plan for getting it done. And then you're hoping that they'll approve it. With a white paper, what you're doing is, you've already created the solution. Now you've got to go out and educate people about it. You have to educate them about the problem. You have to educate them about your solution, and you got to show them that your solution is a great fit. What's the point of producing, a user guide if no one's even aware of the problem or that this user guide can possibly fix it, right? So when you think about who you might be writing to, I wouldn't necessarily say you're writing specifically to your users because that doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, you just created guides for them, but maybe some sort of interested party, like maybe a school district, right? Or maybe a company that produces, user guides for kids, so there's some sort of interested party, but they're public. And then you're trying to persuade them that you've solved this cool problem. Okay. So, proposals often begin at the beginning of a project. Okay. And then reports of various kinds will occur kind of in the middle. There's usually a progress report, kind of like your presentation was. At the end, there might be a technical report. There might be a white paper, and then those sometimes complete the project cycle and sometimes they start a whole new project cycle, right? Okay, so just remember that these components, whether they're of a proposal or a report, things like the introduction, the problem, the project or solution, the evaluation, these are generic components. What that means is that's not necessarily the parts of a proposal or the parts of a report. So a lot of times when we write an internal document, we might use these more generic names like problem statement or solution. But when we're writing to a more public audience, it's important to know that these are generic components and they're not always called that. So for example, you're obviously going to have a problem statement in your report, but it's not necessarily going to be called problem statement. So I don't want you to treat this as an outline of a white paper. I just want you to know these are components of a white paper, and depending on the document, depending on the writers, depending on the project, depending on the audience, these can take on different forms and they can occur in, different ways. So just remember that these things are generic, meaning they're a common component to this type of document. They're not always called that. So for example, if you just call Stephen King's book, It, horror, that's the same as calling a problem statement a problem statement. Does that make sense? So if I open up a report and I see problem statement, that's really generic. It doesn't really tell me anything. So we're about to look at some examples of white papers, and they do have all of these components, but they're just not always called these things. And so what I want you to do when you're looking at the examples of the white papers, I want you to think about how did they put these components into play? How did they actually do this? Because there's a lot of different ways to do it. If you look at the assignment description, I haven't told you exactly what to do. I've given you some criteria for success, but I have not told you exactly how to write this white paper. That's because this is pretty much the final document that you're producing right before a reflective report. So I'm trying to kind of test what you've learned this semester. I want you to come up with a more specific audience. I want you to create a white paper that does what it needs to do. And I want you to design and organize and write that white paper in a way that makes sense for your audience. I don't want to give you an arbitrary outline. I don't want to give you an arbitrary template. I'm not going to give you arbitrary page numbers. I want you to use everything that you've learned this semester to create a detailed and engaging white paper for a specific public audience. Okay? And so who you've decided is more specific audience to you and how each group gets that done is going to vary. So obviously each white paper needs to have these components, right? It needs to do these things. But there are a lot of different ways you can do that. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. Now, these examples, I chose these because they're public examples. They're professional. They're very good examples. I don't want you to feel intimidated. First of all, they're longer than yours is probably going to be. Second of all, they're designed in a very professional way, probably using Adobe Illustrator. And we don't have that kind of, access to technology in this class. So don't be intimidated, but they are really good examples. There are things about them that work really well that you can do. And so even if you just create, a Word document, you can still do these things. So for example, let's take a look at this Marine Stewardship Council one. And I think this is a pretty good example of white paper. Again, way too long. You're not going to write a 25-page document. And obviously, the design is not something that we're able to do. But I want to show you what makes it a good white paper. First of all, it has a title page, okay? Has a table of contents. Remember those features of a technical document that we've discussed this semester. So it has navigation, has a really great organization. You'll see that it has information hierarchy, really good document design. And so there's section headings, there are headings, subheadings, there's information chunking. You'll see it's written in block style. There's a good use of white space. So really embodies all the things that we've talked about this semester in terms of the features of a technical document. Has really good document structure, really good organization. Now look at the actual content. There's usually in a white paper some sort of section somewhere that addresses the reader. So in a formal proposal, this is usually called like an executive summary. In a report, it can also be called an executive summary. A lot of times it's also written as a cover letter. You can see here and in all these examples, there is some sort of letter or section that addresses the reader. It's not called an executive summary. It's not called a cover letter. Those are generic components, but that's what they are. They're addressing the reader. So the reader, remember that the reader has those questions. When anybody looks at any kind of document, they're asking themselves, what is this? Okay, well, the title page is going to tell us that, and so is the table of contents. It's going to tell us what's in it. Someone's going to ask, okay, so what is it? They're going to ask, why am I reading it? Well, these messages or, these executive summaries, these cover letters, they tell the reader, hey, this is for you. This is relevant to you. Or you might read it and go, this is not for me, right? It tells you why you're reading it, okay? And it tells you what you should do with it. So anyone's going to ask, what is this? Why am I reading it? Why should I care? And what should I do with it? That's what these messages start to do. Okay. And then it gets kind of into an introduction. It's not called introduction. You'll notice that it's called overcoming phishing. But how do I know it's an introduction? Because I know what the generic components are, okay, of a report. And every document has an introduction. They don't call it introduction because introduction is just like a boring generic term. So what they've done is after they've written whatever they wanted to write, they came back and chose, a heading name that more effectively forecasted what was coming up. So they could have called it a lot of things, but they said overcoming phishing. So they're giving some background information, right? And they've even done this cool like historical timeline. This is all background information that you would normally find like in an introduction. And then they start delving into some of the needs, right? Like what are some of the problems? What are some of the needs? And they detail those and they break them down. And then they start kind of talking about some of the solutions that they are implementing. And then they evaluate the progress they've made on them so far. So, if you were just flipping through this, you wouldn't see solution. You wouldn't see project evaluation. You wouldn't see problem. But that's what they're doing. Introduction, let's go more in depth on the problem or aspects of the problem that we want to solve. Here's some particular things that we're trying to do, and then we're going to evaluate how we're doing at them. And then, like I said, they've just gone back in and they've added more descriptive sort of subheadings or section headings so that the reader more effectively knows what is in that section. If someone just said problem, it's really generic, right? It's not specific, and it's also not engaging. So by naming the different sections this way, not only is it more specific, but it's also more engaging and interesting. And the whole thing reads more like a really cool story rather than like some dry report. You'll also notice that they use a lot of visuals. All the visuals that we've talked about this semester, things like information visualizations, data visualizations, tables, visual elements, all of these things are being utilized here because visuals help convey information concisely and quickly. Visuals can help you to make abstract relationships or concepts more concrete. Visuals are more engaging. So, that's another thing that they have in common. This one from the white paper guy, I've actually linked to this. Somewhere you can kind of look up his this guy, the white paper guy. Sorry, he actually has a whole website on white papers. This is another good example. It's done a little bit differently. Again, there's a title page that tells you what this document is. There's an introduction here that sort of helps make it relevant to the reader right away. And then it outlines the problem and it breaks the problem down. So instead of like some big like generic problem description, it's like challenge number 1, challenge number 2, challenge number 3. So whatever the problem is, he's now broken it down into 3 specific aspects. And then kind of talks about, this is the literature review, what's wrong with existing tools. So sort of surveys, what are solutions that are currently out there that aren't working, and then walks through his solution, right? He even called it the solution, but then he breaks it down. So this one might feel a little bit more attainable because it's, it's shorter, and it kind of still signals some of those generic components. One of the ways you can do that is actually have like a generic term like the solution and then a more specific subheading. And then the organization is kind of breaking down the problem and then breaking down the solution. So it's a little bit more clear maybe. And then here's a third example that I found online. Again, this one's way too long. I wouldn't recommend even reading the whole thing. It's so long, and it is, again, it's like overwhelmingly beautiful, but you'll see it still has those same kind of, components of effective document design and features of a technical document. It addresses the reader in some way, has a table of contents, and then it goes over like the problem and solution, but it doesn't call it those things, right? It's breaking it down in different ways, but then going back in and kind of renaming those sections in a way that's more relevant to the reader. So I just wanted to show you 3 different examples, and I poured through a lot of examples of white papers online. Again, yours do not have to, this one's probably the more attainable one. You don't have to look exactly like this. I'm not expecting something like this. But what I want you to look at is, how is it embodying the features of a technical document? Okay, how is it organizing the information? And how is it achieving what a white paper should achieve, and how is it, naming these sections in a way that makes it relevant to the reader. So you have a lot of different options. You could do yours, just as a Microsoft Word document. You could take your proposal and repurpose some of that information. If you wanted to try to do something a bit more fancy, you could try, other whatever tools that you feel comfortable with. But just a Word document would be fine. Think about everything that we've learned this semester, and just try to get inspired by, think about what you learned during the information visualization project and other things we've learned about document design and features of a technical document, and just kind of put it to use in this document in a way that makes sense. But again, yours does not have to be like 100 pages or something. So what do all these have in common? They're highly structured, okay, but they're written in the user's lingo. So they have the features of a technical document, they have headings and subheadings, they have sections, they break things down, but they're not written in a really generic way. They're written in a way that the user can understand what is in this document and why is it relevant to them. They tell a story. They don't just sort of list a bunch of dry information. They really engage the reader and tell a cohesive narrative. So sometimes you have to filter. You can't include everything. Just think about a clear beginning, middle, and end. Think about what the reader needs to know, and think about organizing that in a way that makes sense for them. They use design. They don't just look good, but they use design meaningfully. They use, for example, they use visual design to create an information hierarchy. They use visual design to convey abstract information in a concrete way. They use visuals in a way that's really engaging. And I call it persuasive. You might just call it more like storytelling, but they're not necessarily, I guess, it's not like they're seeking approval for the project, but when you read this, they're really trying to help you understand and convince you of certain aspects of the problem, and that whatever they're doing is actually meeting their goals, right? So they are persuasive in some ways. Okay. There are a lot of ways you can organize this. I know this is kind of messy, but I actually created really basic kind of outlines. How are you going to actually do this is what you might be asking you. I have a lot of information, Dr. B. How do I organize it? So you could first talk about, obviously you're going to have, no matter what, you're going to have an introduction and conclusion, right? No matter what, you're going to have a title page and a table of contents. Okay, all of these have those, so that should be pretty obvious. But how do you organize the internal information? You could first discuss the problem and who it impacts, right? You can do that in a lot of different ways. You can take a look at how these other examples have done it. You can kind of pitch them the overall problem. You can break down specific aspects of the problem. And then, who it impacts, who's affected by this problem. And then you can kind of address like the different needs, right? So we have if you look here, on this example, he has like challenge number 1, challenge number 2, challenge number 3. So based on what you know about the general problem overall, you could break it down by here's need number 1 and here's my guide as a solution to that problem. Here was need number 2. And so here's why we created this guide as a solution to this problem. So you could sell the overall problem and who it impacts, and then you could articulate it more specifically as a set of needs and sort of pair the problem and the solution together. So you're addressing particular parts of the problem and then particular solutions to the problem. Another way that you could do it is, again, kind of go over an introduction and problem, and then you could pair the user with the solution. So it's, here would be maybe need number 1 is something like, what I'm trying to say is here, you're kind of discussing who it impacts with the problem and then the specific needs and why you created the guide. So maybe a need is to educate kids about how to spot fake accounts. Here, there's a lot of ways you could solve that problem. So what was the way that your group decided to, right? So what you're trying to do is articulate each of your guides as a solution to one part of the problem. Another way you could do that is then actually talk about your guide as a solution that is crafted for a specific user. This might kind of make more sense because this is how we did the assignment, is everybody picked a specific user. But there are many ways you could kind of package this. So here you would be discussing a specific user, how they're impacted by the problem, and then presenting your guide as a solution tailored for them and like why that works. Another way you could do it is break down the problem in a specific way, talk about who the users are, and then talk about each guide. So here you're sort of presenting it one by one. Here you're sort of pairing them up. Problem solution, user, problem solution. And then, so this is more like a traditional technical report. But one of the things that you could do is you could go find one of these examples. Like, let's say you really like this example here, and you could just reverse outline it. And then you could use that as a guide for creating your own. There are a lot of different ways you could organize this report. You could even kind of base it on this. Just know that I wouldn't call it introduction, problem, projects, evaluation, because again, those are generic components, but you could use this as a start and then break down each section in a little bit more detail, and then just remember to go back and change the headings to where they're more descriptive. So there are a lot of ways you can organize this report. At first, you might not really understand exactly what's going on. I want you to know that confusion is part of having to make these decisions as you write, basing those decisions on understanding who your user is and how to best write it and design it for your user. So you're not an expert at that yet. So at first you're going to be confused. You're going to have these, but you're going to work through them as you're writing the guide. And you can always reach out for help, feedback, for me, run things by me. Okay. You can adapt content from your proposal. If you look at the components of a proposal and the components of a white paper, right, even looking at these outlines, you have some of this stuff already. It's maybe not quite detailed enough yet because when you wrote your proposal, it was about something you haven't done yet. So now that you have done it, you could write about it in a more concrete and detailed way. But you can adapt some of this content. The trick is you can't just copy and paste your problem description from your proposal and slap it into your report. Why? One, because the proposal is about something you haven't done yet, okay? So it's not as specific and detailed as it needs to be. Two, the proposal's for an internal audience, and the white paper is to a public audience, okay? And then three, it may not work as written for the kind of organization that you're creating, but you can repurpose that content. You can revise it, shape it, break it up, add things to it, take things out. You can actually revise it and reshape it. So, you can take some of your introduction, conclusion, maybe even your user profiles and problem statement, and you can repurpose those into certain sections of your report. Like, you can take what you know about your users to write like a cover page. You could add a little bit of more detail or rewrite some of the stuff in your, instead of internal professional language, more like your, external public, audience lingo, right? So you could probably take some of your introduction, conclusion, user profiles, and problem statement and repurpose those a little bit. Just remember that you need to tell a story to an outside reader. So you want to reshape that content so it's meaningful to someone who's unfamiliar with your project. Okay, that's going to be a little bit different than writing to an internal project. You want to add some context. You want to add some interest, some actionable information. You can adapt details from your plan and user guides to help you add specifics to your report, but you're not going to take your plan section and slap it into a report. The plan section is part of the proposal. That's a generic component of a proposal. If you look at the outline and the components of a white paper, it's not in there. But there's probably really good details in those sections that you can use when you're talking about your solutions and why they're a good fit to this problem. So you can use details from your plan and descriptions and summaries of your guides to make your writing more concrete. You could even use examples or screenshots of your guides. If you look at these, you see there's so many visuals. Since you're discussing an actual thing that you created, there's no reason why you couldn't take screenshots and incorporate those as visuals in your white paper. But remember to be more specific and descriptive, because you've actually done it now. You can be more detailed than when you were pitching the idea in the proposal. Just remember that not all information in your proposal is needed for the report. For example, like the collaboration section. So you're going to cut some of that content and you're going to have to write some content. So while you can repurpose some of the content from your proposal, you can't just turn in your proposal as a report. You're going to have to write some content, reshape some content, and make some decisions about what's useful for the report and what's not useful for the report. And that is just, it's a meaningful exercise to do anyway. So it helps you to really understand, what are the parts of a proposal and what are the parts of a report or white paper. Okay. So resources to help you with this assignment. These are the components of generic components. These are some possible ways of organizing your content. Here's some examples that you can look at to kind of help you, kind of plan how you want to do this. You can adapt some content from your proposal. What I would do is decide on, kind of the kind of white paper I'd like to create. I would think about an outline. I would go ahead and outline it and make sure it has all the components that it needs. And then I would go through and find the content that I can repurpose from my proposal, and I would stick that into my outline. I would go create visuals, stick that into my outline, and then write whatever's left. Okay. You also have your textbook. Again, this is a technical report that's a little bit more written to an internal professional audience, but it still has really great information. You can easily adapt this to a public audience. It has types of reports, talks about common report sections, design and format. It gives you examples. So if you really do feel, kind of stuck, you can use this as a guide. The main thing I want you to remember, if you use this kind of technical report or analytical report as an example, it's totally fine in terms of structure. Just remember that these components are generic components, right? So we might call something, for example, results in an internal kind of professional technical report, but we're not going to call it that when we're writing to the public. We're going to change the name of it to where it is more descriptive of what's in that section and more engaging for the audience. So if you wanted to use this as a guide for writing, you could just remember when you're shaping it up that you're going to adapt it, right, for your audience and write in their lingo and then tell a story. Okay. And remember that this is slightly persuasive. It's not just objective. So I really hope that this clears everything up. And again, I know that it's frustrating. People sometimes want me to just give them an outline and some arbitrary page limits. But remember that we've been practicing how to tailor documents to an audience all semester long. And I'm really testing you here to see what you're going to do and how you can take everything that we've learned this semester about organization, information hierarchy, features of a technical document, visual design, everything, and come up with something that's really, unique to your project. Every group has a unique project and a unique approach. So every group's going to approach this differently. If you want to get inspired by one of these and just go for it, that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to use the textbook and the outline there to get started, and just remember to adapt it to a public audience before you turn it in. Okay. If you have any questions, please reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions that are not answered by this video, any of the resources I've posted, etc. I'm happy to meet with your group and, give you feedback on what you're working on. So please reach out if you have any questions. Other than that, I look forward to reading your reports.